We open with a joke. That's almost not a joke. Russia's newest cruise missile runs on a jet engine you can add to your cart on AliExpress. It's not a knockoff or a scavenged part pulled from a downed aircraft. Instead, it's a real, listed, buy-it-now product originally built for hobbyist model jets. Russian engineers took that and bolted it onto a warhead. And in a single night, a Ukrainian air defense crew shot one of these down with an anti-aircraft gun older than most of their grandparents. This is the story of the S8000 Banderol, or how a cash-strapped defense industry built a missile out of the global hobby shop, and how Ukraine is knocking it out of the sky with Cold War hardware. Let's start with what the Banderol actually is, because it doesn't fit neatly into the categories we're used to. Russia's cruise missile family has traditionally meant things like the Kh-101, the 3M14 caliber, or the 9M727 used in the Iskander K system. They're expensive, purpose-built weapons designed in dedicated missile bureaus, produced in relatively small numbers and reserved for high-value strikes. The Banderol is pretty much the opposite of that. It was developed by Kronshtadt, a company that isn't a missile house at all, but the manufacturer of Russia's Orion drone, a medium-altitude, long-endurance unmanned aircraft. Kronshtadt took the concept of unmanned aerial vehicle and essentially militarized it into an expendable jet-powered strike weapon. The result is something that sits between a kamikaze drone and a classical cruise missile, closer in spirit to Ukraine's own rocket drones than to anything in Russia's older cruise missile lineage. On specifications, the drone is small, yet packs quite a punch. The Banderol cruises at roughly 600 km per hour, with the maximum speed cited at around 650 km per hour. That's fast enough that it outruns the kind of weapon systems Ukraine has traditionally used against slower Shahed-type drones. Its range is also reported to be respectable at up to 500 km, which is enough to reach deep behind the front line from a launch point well inside occupied territory or Russian airspace. The warhead used for the weapon is high-explosive fragmentation, with Ukraine's Defense Intelligence, or HUR, citing a weight around 114 kilograms, though some reports put the range as high as 150 kilograms. Either way, this is not a weapon built to level a hardened bunker. It's built to shred soft targets like radar arrays, logistic depots, apartment blocks, or anything that doesn't need a dedicated bunker buster to put out of action. The weapon's primary launch platform is the Orion drone itself, and Kronshtadt was reportedly working to adapt it for launch from the Mi-28N attack helicopters as well, which would give Russia a second delivery method with a much shorter setup time. But what actually makes the Banderol newsworthy isn't the airframe. Instead, we need to focus on what's inside it. In May 2025, Ukraine's Defense Intelligence published a technical breakdown of the missile on its War and Sanctions portal in the Weapon Components section, after examining intact examples recovered from strikes near Odessa. What they found was less a precision-guided missile and more a parts bin assembled from half the consumer electronics industry. The engine driving this thing through the sky turned out to be a Swiwin SW800 Pro, a Chinese-made turbojet originally designed for large-scale model aircraft and radio-controlled jets. It sold commercially, openly, for around $16,000, and yes, it's listed on AliExpress. The rest of the parts list reads the same way. HUR identified the telemetry module as likely an RFD-900X, a unit either sourced from Australia directly or produced as a Chinese clone of the Australian design. The inertial navigation system is believed to be of Chinese origin, paired with a Russian-made Kometa M8 satellite receiver. This has been the same jam-resistant antenna technology Russia has been fitting to its Shahed-derived German drones and its UMPK and UMPB glide bomb kits. The servos, or small motors that move the control surfaces, were South Korean Dynamixel MX64 AR units, also available on the market. And scattered through the electronics are roughly 20 distinct types of microchips, sourced from manufacturers in the United States, China, Switzerland, Japan, and South Korea. But how does a sanctioned Russian company get its hands on parts from that many countries, openly manufactured by firms that, presumably, don't want their products turning up in cruise missiles fired at Kyiv? According to HUR, most of the electronic components moved through a single distribution point, a Russian electronics wholesaler called Chip and Dip, one of the country's largest domestic distributors. From there, earlier Ukrainian intelligence reporting describes a sanctions evasion network that routes these imports through intermediary countries. These include Armenia, Kazakhstan, China, Turkey, and the United Arab Emirates, all using shell companies to obscure the paper trail before the parts ever reach a Russian production line. This report is traced through an open-source analysis rather than a confirmed government finding, but the pattern lines up with a broader pattern Western sanctions enforcement has struggled with for years, which is that dual-use electronics are hard to control once they are commodity products sold at consumer scale. There's also a financial thread to this story. Kronshtadt, the company building the Banderol, has not exactly been a picture of corporate stability. In one report in August 2025, the company was facing potential bankruptcy, with around 40 lawsuits totaling roughly $7.7 million filed against it over 3 months, and no clear path to restructuring at the time of that reporting. This complicates the efficient low-cost war machine framing, as even Russia's budget solution to precision strike capability appears to be running on financially shaky ground. So when did this thing actually show up on the battlefield, and how much is Russia actually using it? One of the earliest reports of the Banderol was at Russia's Kapustin Yar test site in late 2024, before its integration into Russia's combined missile and drone strike packages. Since then, it's become a recurring feature in some of the largest bombardments of the war. Russian forces reportedly used Banderol munitions in the May 2026 strike that also included the Oreshnik missile. The weapon has since been used in widespread attacks, with direct reports indicating that bystanders heard the engines of these drones overhead. So this isn't even a rare experimental weapon anymore. It's being folded into Russia's mass strike doctrine alongside Shaheeds, Calibers, and ballistic missiles. And that mass strike role is exactly why the Banderol is dangerous in a way that's different from a conventional cruise missile. An April 2025 assessment based on an analyst-expert open-source opinion indicated the Banderol's jet propulsion gives it speed unlike that of a traditional drone. This means standard ground-based machine guns, the kind Ukrainian mobile fire teams have used to shoot down slower Shahed drones, simply can't track and engage with the drone effectively. Countering it requires systems purpose-built to track fast, maneuvering targets, usually radar-guided platforms like the German-supplied Gepard self-propelled anti-aircraft gun. That's the core tactical problem of the Banderol. It's fast enough to slip past the cheap counter-drone defenses Ukraine has spent 3 years building up, while being cheap enough that Russia can afford to lose a meaningful number of them in the process. It also has more maneuverability than Russia's older crews, which matters against static air defense systems that are tuned to predict more conventional, straighter flight paths. Which brings us to the twist in this story. In mid-July 2026, Ukraine's 121st Separate Territorial Defense Brigade shot down 2 Russian aerial targets, one of them a Banderol, using 40mm Bofors L70 anti-aircraft guns. If that name doesn't mean much to you, the Bofors L70 is a Swedish-designed anti-aircraft gun that first emerged in 1947 and formally entered service in 1951, and it's been fielded by militaries around the world continuously since. We're talking about a weapon system that is, depending on the specific unit, somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 years old, with a rate of fire generally cited between 240 and 330 rounds per minute, and an effective range against aerial targets of roughly 4,000 meters. More specifically, the guns used by the 121st Brigade had no major modifications beyond upgraded sighting systems, meaning the crews are very likely doing this with largely manual targeting, tracking a jet-powered missile with a gun designed before modern digital fire control systems existed. That's particularly notable because other operators have gone the opposite direction with this same gun. Some countries have paired the L70 with radar fire control and automatic target tracking, turning it into a much more modern point defense system. Ukraine's donated units, at least as reported, are the bare-bones version. Lithuania delivered the first batch of these guns to Ukraine back in February 2023, with additional guns supplied later by the Netherlands. So this isn't even a weapon Ukraine built or maintained, but a Cold War-era NATO surplus, repurposed to plug a very 21st century air defense gap. Now it's worth spending a moment on the other missile that went down that week, because the contrast tells its own story. The Kh-59, or as NATO calls it, the AS-13 King Bolt, is a much older design than the Banderol, dating back to Soviet development in the 1970s and 80s, now produced by Russia's Tactical Missiles Corporation. Depending on the exact variant, it has a range of somewhere between roughly 115 and 290 kilometers, a top speed in the range of 900 to just over 1,000 per hour, and a warhead in the area of 300 kilograms, meaning it's considerably heavier than the Banderols. Its guidance is a mix of inertial navigation for the mid-course flight, a television camera in the nose that lets an operator aboard the launch aircraft visually identify and lock onto the target in the final approach. In other words, the KH-59 is a genuinely old-school precision weapon, requiring a trained operator watching a video feed at the critical moment. The Banderol, by contrast, is largely autonomous once launched, GPS and inertial guided, and built to be cheap enough that losing one to a 70-year-old anti-aircraft gun barely registers on Russia's production ledger. Same week, same brigade, same guns, but two completely different philosophies of how to build a missile. It's also worth noting that the Bofors story isn't the only air defense success Ukraine has had against this kind of saturation threat. The same report noted that a single Ukrainian Skynex system destroyed 12 Russian aerial targets in one engagement, including a cruise missile and 11 Shahed-type drones. This is what having a modern, radar-directed German air defense unit, built specifically to shoot down fast, small, low-flying targets gives you, especially when Russia is using drones that have come out of commercial factories. Put those two stories side by side, and you get a fairly honest snapshot of how Ukraine is actually defending its skies right now. Not with one silver bullet system, but with a patchwork. On one end, there's a cutting-edge radar-guided German gun. On the other, you have a manually aimed Swedish antique. Both are doing the same fundamental job because there simply aren't enough of the modern systems to cover everything at once. And more importantly, around the same time, a video shared by an open-source analyst using the handle Special Kherson Cat appeared to show a Russian Orion drone, the same platform that carries the Banderol, burning in a field in occupied Crimea after apparently being destroyed by its own side rather than by Ukrainian action. Researchers geolocated the wreckage to a village called Ivanivka, roughly 13 kilometers from Kerch and 11 kilometers from the airfield these drones typically operate out of. The video fits the broader picture of a weapons program built quickly, cheaply, and under sanctions pressure. Sometimes it works well enough to punch through Kyiv's defenses in a 500-plus weapon barrage, and sometimes it apparently falls out of the sky on its own side of the front line. So why does any of this matter? Well, a few reasons, and they go beyond the fact that a museum-piece anti-aircraft gun beat a jet-powered missile in a straight fight. But before that, make sure you're subscribed to The Military Show. We bring you news from global geopolitics and sometimes cover events that might seem like out of fiction, such as this story right here. Back to how exactly the Banderol fits in the broader context of the war. First, the weapon is a case study in what sanctions pressure actually does to a wartime economy. You can't stop weapons production outright, but instead the country is increasingly pushed towards improvisation. Russia can't easily source the precision optics, radiation-hardened electronics, or purpose-built turbojets that would go into a traditional high-end cruise missile at the volumes it needs. So instead, it's building a missile out of parts anyone with a credit card and an AliExpress account could theoretically buy piece by piece, routed through intermediary countries and wholesale distributors to obscure the trail. That's a sign of a military-industrial complex adapting to scarcity by going down market, and it's forcing Western governments and export control regimes to reckon with just how porous consumer electronics supply chains are when the end user has enough patience to launder the purchase through 2 or 3 intermediary countries. Second, there's the cost equation of this war, and here it helps to actually put numbers next to the weapons we keep mentioning. Estimates for Russia's KH-101 vary enormously depending on who's doing the reporting. Ukrainian and Western analysts have put it anywhere from around $1.2 million on the low end to as much as $13 million on the high end. The caliber sits somewhere in a similarly wide band, commonly cited from around $1 million to $6 million, depending on the export versus domestic distinction. A standard Shahed-136 style drone, by contrast, is usually put at somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000. The Ukrainian intelligence assessments of Russia's domestically produced versions have run as high as $70,000. We're hedging all of these numbers deliberately, because unlike the Banderol's component list, these broader missile cost figures are contested estimates, not verified contracts, and outlets openly disagree with each other by a factor of 5 or even 10. But even taking the most conservative end of every range, a missile built around a $16,000 hobbyist jet engine and consumer-grade servos and batteries sits far closer to the drone side of that ledger than the missile side. That means Russia can produce and expend these things at a volume that would be unthinkable for something like the Kh-101, and fold them into mass strikes specifically designed to overwhelm Ukrainian air defense through sheer number of simultaneous threats rather than through any single weapon's sophistication. The Banderol isn't trying to be the smartest missile in the sky. It's trying to be one more fast-moving problem in a barrage that already includes Shaheeds. This is also where the "is it a drone or a missile" argument stops being pedantic and starts actually mattering for how Ukraine builds its defenses. Russia has been running the same experiment on its Shaheed line that it ran on the Banderol, bolting jet engines onto what used to be simple propeller-driven loitering munitions, producing variants like the Geran 3 and Geran 5 that can reportedly hit speeds around 500 to 600 km per hour. This would put them squarely in cruise missile territory. Ukrainian Air Force spokesman Yuri Ignat has described the effect bluntly, saying that on radar, one of these jet-powered variants displays as a cruise missile by its flight parameters alone, simply because of how fast it's moving. That determines which interceptor Ukrainian battery commander reaches for, and interceptors are not interchangeable in price. A single AIM-120 AMRAAM, the missile NASAM batteries have used to shoot down slower Shaheeds, run somewhere in the range of $500,000 to $1 million per shot. A Patriot PAC-3 interceptor runs closer to $4 million. When a $16,000 engine forces you to spend $500,000 to several $1 million just to knock it out of the sky, the exchange rate is the whole point of the weapon, regardless of whether you file it under drone or missile. It's also worth saying that Ukraine is playing the same game in the opposite direction. Ukraine's Palianytsia missile drone, first used in combat in August of 2024, weighs around 320 kilograms with roughly a 100 kilogram warhead, takes off on a solid fuel booster before its turbojet engine takes over, and is reported to reach X speeds up to 900 km per hour with a range around 650 km. This is nearly comparable to the Kh-101. Ukrainian officials have put its unit cost at under $1 million, and some Ukrainian estimates have gone lower still. Its sibling program, the Peklo, is reportedly even cheaper to build than Ukraine's Lyuty long-range attack drone, which itself cost around $200,000, all the while reaching speeds of up to 700 km per hour and a range of roughly 700 km, with developers claiming as much as 70% domestically produced components. In other words, both sides have independently concluded that the fastest way to close the gap between cheap drone and expensive missile is to just build something that splits the difference, and that whoever can build more of that hybrid class faster is going to have the edge in this particular arms race. Third, the weapons matter, because they're forcing Ukraine to fight an asymmetric defensive war on two very different technological levels at the same time. On one end, Ukraine is standing up genuinely cutting-edge systems, German Gepards purpose-built to track fast-maneuvering targets, and even, as we covered elsewhere, early laser-based counter-drone systems. On the other end, when the modern systems aren't available in enough numbers, Ukrainian crews are reaching for whatever works, including donated, decades-old anti-aircraft guns with little more than a slight upgrade. That a Bofors L70 can still bring down a 2026 vintage jet-powered missile isn't really a story about Cold War engineering being ahead of its time. It's a story about air defense at its core, still coming down to whether a crew can track, aim, and put rounds in front of a target before it arrives, and about how thin Ukraine's air defense inventory has had to stretch to cover every altitude, speed, and flight profile Russia keeps throwing at it. Put it all together, and the Banderol tells us something bigger about where this war's weapon technology is heading. The line between drone and cruise missile is dissolving. What used to be two separate categories, with two separate defense playbooks, is collapsing into a single class of fast, cheap, jet or prop-powered GPS and inertial guided munitions that can be built from largely off-the-shelf parts. Ukraine's own Palianytsia and Peklo programs are essentially the same idea running in the opposite direction. Whoever can build these things faster and cheaper, and whoever can adapt their air defense the quickest, is going to have an edge in the next phase of this fight. For now, the score in this particular matchup goes in favor of Ukraine's olden gun, and that itself is also notable because it suggests that we're not quite done seeing weapons that by all accounts should be obsolete. The front line in Ukraine is essentially a diorama of weapons throughout technological generations, all showcasing just how important every little piece of advantage, ingenuity, and adaptation can be. But Ukraine has more tricks up its sleeve. To learn more, check out this video, and make sure to stay subscribed to the Military Show to stay up to date with the most recent developments from the front line.